Welcome to the course. An unusual way of delivering the course this year, but we're going to be discussing political thought on the Just Rebellion. And this covers a very great deal of very interesting and nuanced material. So this first lecture is to try to give some kind of orientation as to how we should approach this particular topic of political thought on the Just Rebellion. I'm going to start with a poem. You're going to get a lot of poetry, as well as a whole lot of crazy stories in this course. But this poem is by John Milton. John Milton was a very famous poet in the English Revolution of the 17th century. And the English Revolution was when Parliament, the forces of Parliament, defeated the king, Charles I. And in fact, they executed him. For those of you who have been to Whitehall and you've gone down Whitehall, walking from Trafalgar Square towards Big Ben, you would have noticed the banquet rooms on your left. Well, the scaffold on which Charles was executed was just outside the banquet rooms. You can go in as a tourist, and if you see the murals on the ceiling, those would have been the last paintings that Charles I would have seen before he was led to his decapitation. Now, this was really quite amazing, because up to then, what you had was what they called the divine right of kings. Kings were sanctioned, placed into office, and supported by God. They were, as it were, a representative of heaven on earth. So to take the fight against the king, who would justify his power by reference to the absolute power of heaven, was a rebellion of a very significant sort. So the legacy of the English Revolution, although it was not in any way ideological, like, for instance, a communist revolution, not ideological, but very, very much in ethical terms to do with the right to rebel. And what you had in the works of John Milton, the epic poem Paradise Lost, you have the parallel against which the English Revolution was set, and that was the rebellion of Satan against God. Now, in the Bible, God defeats Satan. St. Michael casts Satan out of heaven into hell. And this is the setting for part of the poem by John Milton. Satan rouses his fallen angels in the darkness of hell. He was a prince among the angels. Now, all he has to rule over himself is hell. Is this the region, this the soil, the clime? Said then the lost archangel, this the seat that we must change for heaven, this mournful gloom for that celestial light? Be it so, since he, who now as sovereign can dispose and bid what shall be right, furthest from him is best, whom reason hath equal, force hath made supreme above his equals. Farewell, happy fields, where joy forever dwells. Hail, horrors, hail, infernal world, and thou, profoundest hell, receive thy new possessor, one who brings a mind not to be changed by place or time. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. What matters where, if I be still the same, and what I should be, or but less than he, whom thunder hath made greater? Here, at least, we shall be free. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, will not drive us hence. Here we may reign secure, and in my choice, to reign is worth ambition, though in hell. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. This was the beginning, this was the birth of the archetype of the romantic rebel, of the anti-hero. Satan, far from being a figure of evil, becomes here a figure of heroic resistance and rebellion. And it's certain to train the entire orientation of modern European thought on the question of rebellion. Now, this is not to say that there is not rebellion that is expressed in ethical and philosophical terms from other cultures outside of the European. We shall come to those. But for now, we must realize that we are starting with a particular element of modernity. Now, this element of modernity didn't come out of nowhere. The whole idea of just in rising up, justice in resistance, really came from early Christian thoughts, particularly the thought of St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church in North Africa. Legend has it that he himself was a black bishop. And in Augustine's great works, I think you've got three noteworthy things that are remembered. The first, of course, is the great work called The City of God, in which the magnificence of God and the perfection of God is so great that nothing man does could even begin to approach it. The second, of course, are the series of works called Augustine's Confessions. He, let us say, led a problematic life and wrote about them in a very, very candid way, discussing the nature of fallibility. But the third thing that is his legacy, and really his legacy for this course, is his theory on what is just war. Now, we're going to be relying to a certain extent on his theory of the just war, because there really is no theory of the just rebellion. What we have is taking the just war theory promulgated by him, later by St. Thomas Aquinas, and using that as a template for how we should approach the justice of rebellion. And I was directed to do this by the famous Oxford philosopher Anthony Kenny. I was at All Souls, one of the elite colleges at Oxford. I wasn't a member, I was just an invited attendee at the weekly seminars in the room where Charles surrendered to the forces of Parliament before being led to trial and execution in London. And Anthony Kenny basically said something very controversial. He said, if we apply just war theory to what the IRA is doing in its rebellion against the English crown, we can actually decipher the ethic by which they justify or make just their rebellion. We can also measure to what extent they're able to honor concepts and ethics of justice. This is a profound statement, as the IRA were profoundly disfigured in terms of English renditions of what they were trying to do at that point in time. And indeed, their atrocities were such that the question of whether or not any of this could be celebrated as being just in any way was something which was an open question. But in fact, Kenny proposed a very sophisticated way of looking at it by putting Augustine's theory of just war to the test in the case of this Irish rebellion. Now, just war theory has got two key parts. The first part is called jus ad bellum. That is justice in the causes of war. Why do you go to war? There are all kinds of reasons why you might want to go to war. And the other significant part of this theory was jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war. Now, the two can be separated. You may have every single just cause in going to war. Everything else has failed. You've tried it all. You've promised to use proportionate force. You're not going to commit atrocities, etc., etc. You think that you're going to be exercising justice in your rising up, in your rebellion, in your going to war. But justice in the conduct of war, if you're conducting atrocities on the battlefield, if you're killing innocent people, then a lot of that sense of justice seeps away from you. So no matter how just you are in the build-up to war and the reasons for going to war, being able to maintain justice in the way that you fight war is absolutely key. So we're going to be looking in the course that follows, both in the question of jus ad bellum, justice leading up to war, and jus in bello, justice in the conduct of war, but applying that distinction to our study of rebellions. So we owe Anthony Kenny a debt there, and as I say, this is not the only approach. You've got Indian approaches, Chinese approaches. In terms of the Chinese approach, when you look at the footage of the victorious march past of the Red Army in China, in Tiananmen Square in 1949, after they had won China from the nationalist government and the nationalist forces, the old archive photographs will show Chairman Mao standing in front of one of the old web microphones, and he starts chanting in the ancient language of the shamans. It sounds seriously spooky. And he's calling on heaven. He's using mystical, antique language, claiming the mandate of heaven. For when heaven offers you that mandate, because the previous holders of that mandate had abused it, then those who claim it after the defeat of the previous holders are able to claim it because they were just in their rebellion. So the Chinese also have almost a mystical moment when the forces of rightness and wrongness tilt, and it's important to rise up at that point in time to fight and to claim the mandate of heaven. The Indians too have mystical, historical reasons to do with the justice of rebellion. When you go and accept your lunch from the Hare Krishna people outside Soas, the free lunch, the free vegetarian lunch, the lunch that is blessed, then what you're also looking at is the whole ethos of justice under heaven. And if you look at their key holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, this tells the story of Krishna, who's come down to earth and is the charioteer of Prince Arjuna, who is going to war against his own family. He looks out over the battlefield and sees that the opposition army is led by his own uncles, and he gets faint-hearted. He doesn't want to fight his own family. And Krishna, disguised very thinly as his charioteer, says basically, look, there are cosmic reasons of greater good, and you've got to go to war. It's one of these mystical books that you can argue over forever and ever and ever. My advice is do not get into an argument with our Hare Krishna friends. You'll be there all day long. If you are persuaded to buy a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, their edition has got beautiful socialist realist paintings about Krishna and Arjuna, having this sermon, God to acolyte, on the battlefield before the actual war begins. So different cultures have approached this question of when is it just to fight. And as I say, we're going to apply it to the whole question of rebellion. And rebellion against authority. Authority that has been sanctioned in some way, sanctioned by heaven, in the case of the English Revolution, turning against that. But that is something which, as I said, is part of modernity. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't as if Parliament just rose up one day and said, we're going to have a go at the king. A whole body of political thought accompanied the birth of the English Revolution. A whole series of debates as to the nature of society, therefore the nature of the social contract. Thomas Hobbes, in his great work Leviathan, says that the social contract was established so that people would choose and accept a protector, a king, to hold society together because nature was red in tooth and claw. And so the king and the social contract that he represented as its head prevented the anarchy of nature. Basically, human society was a mark of civilization. However, against that were all kinds of counter theories that, okay, you've got a king, but if he abuses his authority, if he abuses his office, the social contract is withheld. And should there be a king in any case? Thinkers like Winstanley established, really for the first time in modern European thought, later translated, of course, into American thought, that everyone was born equal. And if everyone is born equal, what right of place is there for a king? And this debate continued throughout the entire English Revolution, the diggers and the levellers insisting upon an equality, an absolute equality. The debates on Putney Heath, very, very much to do with that. So that when finally war was concluded by the defeat of the king, the execution of the king was the defeat and the execution of somebody who was not greater than anyone else, who had usurped equality by trying to reign over everyone else. It was unjust to be a king. It was just to execute him. A whole body of thought, as I said, lay into this. Now, having said all of that by way of introduction, what you've got are a number of problems that we've got to deal with in our way of defining various aspects of this course. Now, for instance, if we're talking about a rebellion, what's the difference between a revolt, a rebellion, and a revolution? We'll be looking at those distinctions as a series of working definitions right now. We're looking at the question of revolt as something which is a rising up against one particular instance of injustice, of abuse, of power. There's nothing else to it but this one moment against this one reason for this one explosive act of resistance, for this revolt. If you're looking at revolution, you're looking at not only at overthrow, but you're looking at the total transformation of society. Society revolves into something totally new. A rebellion rises up, and it's programmatic. It's not just over one instance to do with power or the abuse of power. It's programmatic about how society should be run without necessarily overthrowing everything that went before. So the whole question of how you differentiate between the three, we'll be looking at those three in the course that follows. Of course, understanding that there are obvious overlaps between those three. There are other questions that you've got to ask, of course, and that is this question of justice. What do we mean by this question of justice? What's the difference between justice and, for instance, justification? Can we make up a justification and say that we're fighting on the side of justice? How do we differentiate the two? What in justice is the question of an innate decency, an innate sense of natural law, an innate sense of following some kind of philosophical and ethical imperative? What, by way of justification, is there if we're looking and say we're simply making restitution for a law that was broken? If we're looking for restitution of an element of a social contract that was broken, we're looking at a restoration of what went before, making the fragments whole again. In other words, there's not, as it were, a holistic ethical core to which you're referring yourself to, whereas justice has a systematic body of thought and a systematic ethic embodied in it. And it's that systematic body of ethic that constitutes the nature of thought to do with justice. Which brings us, of course, to the question of thought. What do we mean by political thought? Are we looking at political thought as something which is a politicized theology? When we talk about Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, Are we turning their theological thought into something that it was intended for or not intended for? Are we looking at thought as something emanating from a divine command? Is there something in the Bible, in the Quran, indeed in the Bhagavad Gita, that says that you should do something because it's just and therefore we go and do it? But is that thoughtful, or is that merely obedience? Are we looking at thought as something genuinely philosophical? If we look at Immanuel Kant, and we owe people like Immanuel Kant and people like Hegel a very great debt. They're the two great foundational philosophers of modernity in Europe. And you're looking in terms of Kant's theory of recht, of what is right, of the universal law, and a categorical imperative that what is universal law has got to be obeyed on earth. It's almost a metaphysical way of looking at the whole question of justice as something supervening, something which is universal, almost like God's law, although the great philosophers of the Enlightenment in Europe proposed to do away with reliance on God, but they kept using imagery which is very, very much derived from almost a secularized but still mystical version of the old divine sense of the nature of the universe. But all the same, in the question of recht, the question of universal law, of universal rightness, what we have are the foundations of things that we believe in today. An organization like Amnesty International would be impossible without Immanuel Kant. Bills of human rights, charters of human rights would be impossible without Immanuel Kant. The whole question that you have a universal law that's applicable, and here's the rub, to every single individual. That's the categorical imperative. What is universal is also personal. That kind of declension, expressed philosophically in a philosophical system that seeks to show the rightness of the relationship between one and the other, that kind of philosophical thought has something been very profound and has affected all of our thinking quite unconsciously. We all make reference to human rights without knowing that the birth of such thinking is relatively recent. Well, we're looking at political thought as something which is essentially theoretical, something which derives from our reflections on how society operates. We're going to be looking at a couple of theorists in a minute, so let's put that one to one side just for a second before we get to their thought. Or are we looking at political thought as an ideology? You know, the philosophers have understood the world. They haven't really, but the task now is to rise up and strike off the chains of the oppressed rather than simply seeking to understand it. Words derived from Karl Marx. An ideology is something which has a philosophical root, but which proposes that you must act upon it. It is telic, that is to do with a telos. It is purpose-driven. Thought acts to propel action. And those two ingredients, enactment of the ethic of thought in an organized political way, constitutes an ideology. Are we looking at political thought as one of those different categories, or are we looking at some kind of combination of those various categories? Are we able to make a synthesis of these things and call that political thought? We are basically looking, therefore, just in the simple title of this course, as a number of very, very difficult ways of looking at things. So one of the first, as it were, lessons of what we're trying to do here is to be very clear, and to be very clear particularly in our distinctions and in our justifications of what we call justice when we talk about political thought of the just rebellion. So being very clear about those things is, I think, very important, and it's probably the first lesson. But let's return to what I trailed just a minute ago, and that is the question of social theory. The theory of revolution, the theory of rebellion, the theory of social organization. All of these things are connected. Now I'm going to propose that we've got two main ways of looking at a social theory of rebellion. Okay. Now the first is probably personalized or epitomized in the work of Theda Skocpol. Now she was a great American social theorist, and her great book, States and Social Revolutions, is probably to this day almost canonical. It was published in 1979. It's impossible to deal with questions of social organization and social theory without reference to this work. Her great work, and it's going to be her legacy. It is basically a neo-Marxist work proposing that there's a material foundation for uprising, for rebellion. There is something which is embedded in society and in the structure of society and the structure of the state that rules over society that is obliged to provide a degree of material well-being and provision for those members of society. When that material provision is no longer there, when it declines, when it becomes decadent, that sows the seeds for uprising. So theories of revolution, as you're talking about revolution, in Skocpol's terms are very, very much to do with material need, this material foundation. Very, as I say, neo-Marxism, very, very much to do with a material justification for why one wants to rise up. Nothing to do necessarily with the social critique of society as an edifice, as a social contract. The social contract is reduced to material provision and the facilitation of material need and the provision of this material need. Now that's to simplify things very, very much, but let's just accept that for the time being so that we're able to contrast what Theda Skocpol had to say with what Fred Halliday had to say. Now Fred was the professor of international relations at London School of Economics. He was my counterpart there. We were very, very good friends, and we would argue all the time. The students at LSE were sometimes very wicked and would set up debates between myself and Fred, basically on the nature of social organization. And I would go down to LSE, and Fred and I would have a great ding-dong fisticuffs, and basically come to no conclusion but that we had entertained the students very, very well. But on one particular occasion, I think I got the better of Fred. So he rang me up that night and said, "Now, Stephen, don't get carried away by this. Don't forget, after all, I'm the one who can speak Arabic and Farsi and you can't." And this is true. So I want to pay tribute to Fred because he really could do his research in the languages of the countries that he was studying. And he was a great authority on the Middle East. Therefore, his skill, his linguistic command of Arabic was very important, but also his linguistic command of Farsi, the language of Iran, because he became one of the very, very almost dissident voices at the time of the revolution of the Ayatollahs, saying this wasn't just religious fanaticism. There was a lot of thought that went into this, whether you agree with this thought or not. And he basically proposed his view of the Iranian Revolution as a counterpoint to what Theda Skocpol was saying. Fred was basically admitting that when you looked at, for instance, the other great revolutions of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, yes, you could discuss those in terms that Skocpol laid down to do with material provision or the lack of material provision. When you're looking at the later revolution of Iran, and I agree with Fred that there were three great revolutions of the 20th century, Russian, Chinese, and the Iranian. When you come to the Iranian Revolution, there was no material deprivation. The state was providing, in fact, the state was providing in almost an embarrassing abundance. The state of Iran, underneath the Shah, supported by the United States of America, was basically the most prosperous country in the Middle East and its surrounding area. The people of Iran had the highest per capita income in the region. What they rose up for was for a series of reasons to do with A, the need for freedom, but B, expressed in a certain cultural language that the Shah, underneath American influences, sought to repress. Thus the triumph of the Ayatollahs, because they were masters of this alternative language. This is not to justify, again using that interesting term, what happened afterwards. But at the moment of revolution, even the great French philosopher Michel Foucault said this is something amazingly new, because it was a revolution based on the thought of the spirit. It was a cultural context, a religious and a spiritual context, an ideas-filled context that drove the third great revolution of the 20th century. So you've got something there which tends to say, okay, Scotch power is right and fine up to a point, but to omit the spiritual and the cultural from a critique and an analysis that emphasizes almost to the exclusion of anything else, the material, is incorrect. So you're looking at something there which establishes a debate. When we look at our case studies in the course to come, to what extent are we looking at things that are material? To what extent are we looking at things that are ideas-driven? To what extent are we looking at things that are ideas-driven which are to do with spiritual ideas, to do with ideas that are secular? To what extent are secular ideas, after all, drawn from the material context? So we could almost become slightly circular there. And one of the interesting and intriguing things that we'll look at in the course that follows is, what about if you're looking at ideas that make no sense at all? No rhyme, no reason, nothing rational, nothing circular, nothing material, gibberish, rubbish, magical. When the Chinese boxers uprose against European and Japanese occupation in the early part of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, they were driven on by spells of magic that they could overcome the hugely superior firepower of the occupying armies, and of course they were slaughtered. The magic spells didn't protect them at all. By this entire uprising of people prepared to throw themselves into battle and sacrifice themselves, something which was driven from a magical condensation of historical, legendary attributes that were meant to be authentically Chinese, compressed into a very brief period of indoctrination and training before the boxers, so-called, were thrown into battle against the superior firepower of the Americans, the British, the French, you name it. They were there occupying not only Beijing, but particularly the coastal cities of China. China was never colonized, but my goodness, it was certainly imperialized. The British forced the Opium Wars upon the Chinese, for instance, trying to make the Chinese buy opium, turning the nation into drug addicts, simply so that the British merchants could turn a profit. All of these things imperialized the Chinese, and having been so slow in catching up with modern technology, and the Japanese have been very, very fast with this, resorted to antique motifs to try to arm themselves spiritually for revolution against the occupiers, and of course they were defeated. The name boxers, of course, comes from Europeans. Basically, this is the birth of Kung Fu as we know it today. Almost every single style of Kung Fu that you see being taught these days comes from that period of condensation of very, very complex systems into immediate fighting systems for the gates of Beijing or the gates of any other place. But this idea of magic continued, not just in China, but in many other parts of the world. When we look at the Maori rebellion against white settlerdom, for instance, you're looking at elements of syncretic religion that again promised invulnerability against the superior firepower of the European armies. When you're looking at rebellions that we regard now as atrocious, and indeed they are, so this whole question of justice in rebellion and justice in the conduct of rebellion comes into play. But if you look at someone like Joseph Kony, for instance, there's a lot of magic in his rebellion, even though it was atrocious in its execution, almost literally, implementation. No one's tried to interrogate the thought of Joseph Kony and his predecessor, Alice Lakwena. But the idea of rising up because the spirits tell you to do so is something which is almost a trope. For instance, in the Zimbabwean revolution that led to independence as late as 1980, in all kinds of other rebellions in the world today because of a reaction against material society and the impositions of an unfair civilized order that has been brought by international capital, international colonial and imperial outreach. So all of these things come into play, so there's no easy answer to the question of thought, or even the distinctions between cultural and material. Certainly no easy resolution of the question of thought. So what we're going to be looking at in this course are a series of case examples that try to look at all of these things, problematize them in a variety of ways and underneath a variety of conditions. So next week, what we're going to be doing is having a discussion on the whole question of, well, okay, all of these things might be well and good, but what if there's material provision, but just not enough of it, so you can live, you can survive, you can probably survive with a degree of plenitude, but your next door neighbor has got more. Ted Goor in his theory of relative deprivation. Is it a question basically of envy that people rebel? Or are there more luminous questions? We'll be looking at things to do with the question of liberation theology, both in Latin America and in Africa, where people rise up underneath conditions of poverty, but also underneath the guidance of God. So is there a resolution of those two things in the nature of some of the rebellions of today's modern age? The third lecture, returning to the question of Iran, if you're looking for one seminal thinker who animated at least the early foundations of thought of the Ayatollahs and of other people who rose up against the Shah, what is the place of the thinker Ali Shariati, who developed a lot of his thought when he was a doctoral student in Paris and came underneath the spell of the French existential thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, and indeed was a friend of Frantz Fanon. In fact, he translated Fanon's work into Farsi. And Jean-Paul Sartre wrote the forewords to both Fanon's work and to Shariati's work. To what extent was the thought of Shariati influential of the cultural context and the cultural need for uprising, but all the same had embedded within it a fusion of thought that incorporated not only what was then current and fashionable in European thought, but also the thought to do with rebellion that was beginning to develop and to be applied to the African continent. And someone like Fanon remains influential today in the Black Lives uprisings. So we'll move on from there. We'll then digress back to the question of the differences between rebellion and revolution, have a closer look at the revolutions of the 20th century, the Russian, the Chinese, and the predecessor revolutions of modernity, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. The rights of man came out of the first revolutions in Europe and America, work of Thomas Paine, the works of people to do with the establishment of the condition of citizenship in France, questions to do with the Bill of Rights in the United States, and later the constitutionalization of these by Napoleon in the aftermath of the French Revolution. Look at all these ideas, how they carry themselves forward, and put those against the so-called material foundations of the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. Then conclude the first part of the term with a look at the Maori struggles in New Zealand, to which I've referred, the decolonization struggle in Africa. Leading on from that, again, I've referred to some of these in passing, the Pacific rebellions of people like Gandhi, but also the magical rebellions of people like Joseph Kony, in fact, people like Alice Lakwena, people like Joseph Kony. And the question of rebellion by men with guns, when all else fails, but the army decides to turn against the government. This happened just now in Mali. It's happened in military coups around the world. The justification for what Samuel Feiner called the man on horseback to rise up against the secular authorities, the civilian authority that all the same has turned its back on just procedure and just processes. Not just in Africa, not just in Latin America. In my youth, for instance, in Europe, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Turkey, if you call that part of Europe, all had long periods of military rule. Some just in terms of an appreciation after the fact, others certainly fascist in their orientation, as in the case of Franco's Spain, for instance. So we in Europe are not immune to this whole question of militarized rebellion, but we'll be looking at those and also those in the context of African and Latin American jurisdictions. In the case of Europe, of course, the ideas of the fascist dictators, Greece, Spain in particular, linger to this day. They're still a force in the political societies and debates of those particular countries. We'll move on from there to look at the question of rebellion in the way that it can be fostered in educational processes. We'll look at the work of Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire, look at what I call liberation pedagogy. And then conclude the series with, of course, something very topical, something which is very, very controversial. And that is, what is the nature of rebellion in jihad? Is there a justice? Is there a justification? Is there a justice leading up to jihad that is not necessarily present in the carnage that certain advocates and proponents and exponents of jihad have committed? Very, very problematic questions, but questions which cannot be avoided. Notwithstanding the ostensible defeat of ISIS on the battlefield, the ideas of ISIS haven't gone away. And indeed, for those of you very familiar with the cyberspace that it occupies, it's not going to go away anytime soon. Still very much present, still very, very much almost a subliminal background influence in our cyber sphere, in our electronic world. So we'll be looking at all of those, and looking at all of those very, very much in the context of the one thing that is certain, and that is that there's an end to certainty itself. Things ain't going to be normal again. The new normal is actually the new dangerous. We're looking at a world which is essentially in a constant ferment of rebellion of one sort or another. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's an introduction to the course. Giving the course some context, raising some questions about definitions, giving a taster of some of the examples that we'll use to problematize and test what the course is going to cover. Now, just as a couple of matters of housekeeping, the only assessment for this course is one written assignment. We're going to discuss in class what is the best deadline that would suit most people. There does have to be a deadline, I hasten to add, but we'll try to find one which is just, in the sense of being as suitable as possible to the majority of you. An essay of up to about 5,000 words. You can choose your topic, provided it's about political thought on the Just Rebellion, provided you run your choice of topic past me, and you have permission to try to write about that particular topic. And I'm not going to try to hinder your imagination, I'm going to try to hinder your ambition. It's only 5,000 words. You're not going to be able to write a PhD thesis, so don't even try. Very specific topics are what we're looking for. It's also something that I need to ask you to give some thought to. We've got a 2-hour slot each week. We can either have a recorded lecture of this sort, followed by class discussion, or, because I've put a very great deal of material on the Blackboard Moodle site, including a lot of filmed lectures or mini lectures, whether or not to dispense with this long lecture on screen, but incorporate into a 2-hour discussion involving all of us, both lectures and questions and answers, interjections, interventions throughout, relying on the background that will already be available to you, both in filmed mode and also in written mode on the Blackboard Moodle site. So give some thought to it as to what would be most natural for you, okay? What would be most amenable to your learning experience. But for now, welcome to the course. We're going to be, as it were, delving into all of these issues that I raised with you. If we continue with the filmed longer lectures, well, they'll probably be shot here. This is my study at home, and you're going to have to put up with this kind of backdrop for the rest of the course, although I'll keep changing my suits. So ladies and gentlemen, you're very, very welcome, and I hope that you enjoy what we've got to offer and what we all will together discuss as the weeks go by. My thanks.